Mina still remembers that afternoon in Daramo district, sitting on the cool stone steps while voices rose and fell behind the wooden door. She had been part of the Corney family for 3 years, yet every visit made her feel like a stranger borrowing time. She tried to laugh a little at herself when she carried in a tray of tea, but Sarah's aunt waved her off without even looking at her, telling her it was family business. Mina kept her smile in place as she walked back outside, though she could feel the sting behind her eyes. The sky above Daramo was bright and wide, the kind that usually made her feel calm, but that day it only made her feel small. She listened to her name tossed around inside as if she were a problem no one wanted to own. She stepped away from the doorway so no one would see her wipe her cheeks. When she tried to hand Sarah the documents he had forgotten, one of the uncles pushed her back and shut the door in her face. She almost laughed from the shock of it, not because it was funny, but because she suddenly understood something she had been avoiding. They had never planned to accept her. She walked toward the courtyard, telling herself she would call a friend and leave, when Sarah's cousin rushed out with his phone pressed to his ear, eyes wide. He said her name with a strange urgency that made her heart pause, as if the world had shifted without warning. Mina still remembers standing in the narrow hallway of the Corney house in Kafira Ward, her back against the wall as whispers floated through the cracked door. It amazed her how quiet voices could hurt more than shouting. Her name moved from one mouth to another like something heavy no one wanted to hold. She heard an uncle say she didn't contribute enough, though she had spent every weekend helping in the fields. Another voice suggested she wasn't truly part of them, that she was only here because Sarah had been stubborn. She waited to hear her husband speak up, even one small word in her favor, but all she heard was his quiet breathing, the kind he used when he hoped a storm would pass without him. Mina felt a strange laugh slip out of her as she stepped outside, soft and shaky, because she realized the storm wasn't outside the room. It was inside her chest. She didn't want to cry in front of people who watched her as if they were waiting for her to crumble. So she walked out toward the yard, letting the breeze of Kafira cool her cheeks. She stood under the old fig tree, listening to the distant hum of motorbikes from the main road. For a moment, she let herself dream of stepping onto one of them and riding far from the house where she always felt like a guest. She remembered how life was before the marriage, when she lived in the hills of Nakalo, a place full of warm laughter and neighbors who called her by name with real affection. She wondered how she had traded all that for rooms where she had to tiptoe around every word. Still, part of her tried to stay hopeful. She told herself families needed time, that they would someday see her intentions were good. But as she stood there, she felt a weight settle inside her, the kind that made her chest tight. She heard the voices again through the window, like knives wrapped in soft fabric. One aunt said Mina was too quiet, another said she was too independent, and someone else wondered out loud what Sarah had ever seen in her. Mina let out another quiet laugh, this one almost a sigh, because she wanted to ask them the same question. She wanted to know why Sarah chose her if he didn't feel strong enough to choose her in front of them. She looked at her hands, the same hands that cooked for this family, cleaned their pots, helped harvest their maize, and comforted Sarah through hard months. Yet here she was outside again, pushed out by whispers. She leaned her head back and looked at the sky, a soft blue stretching over Kafira, and she wished the sky could speak. At least it would be honest. She stood there until the door creaked open and footsteps moved toward her, but she didn't turn around. She needed one more moment with herself before she faced whatever came next. Mina still remembers how it felt to hold those papers in her hand, walking toward the meeting room in the old Corney house in Lumbasa village. She wasn't even planning to enter. She only wanted to slip the documents to Sarah because he had forgotten them again, and she didn't want him to look unprepared in front of his family. She even smiled a little at herself, thinking how she was always trying to make him look better to people who never cared for her. But when she pushed the door open just enough to call his name, one of the uncles stepped forward so quickly she barely saw the movement. His hand landed on her shoulder, sharp and firm, and he pushed her back as if she were something blocking his path. The door slammed shut before she could say a word. Mina stumbled, almost dropping the papers, the shock hitting her first, then the heat rushing to her face. It felt like her skin was burning from the inside. She stood there for a moment, frozen, hearing the muffled voices continue inside as if nothing had happened. That small shove said more than all the whispers she'd heard earlier. It told her they had never planned to welcome her. Not now, not ever. She laughed under her breath, a soft, cracked sound, the kind you make when your heart is tired but you don't want anyone to hear it. She stepped away from the door and looked down the hallway, the long corridor filled with faded family portraits that never included her. She wondered why she had tried so hard to belong here. She thought of her first months in Mombasa, how she used to carry hope around like a small light in her pocket. She believed that kindness would eventually change things, that showing love to Saro's family would make her a real part of them. But the shove at the door felt like the final answer to a question she had been asking for years. Mina turned toward the courtyard, her hands shaking as she clutched the papers. The afternoon sun spilled across the ground, warm and bright, the kind of light that usually comforted her. Today it only made the tears in her eyes shine more clearly. She whispered to herself that she should have left long ago, not in anger, but in that quiet, honest way truth speaks when you stop running from it. She walked outside and let the air fill her lungs, trying to steady her heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing, and the sound made her smile for a moment. Life outside this house still held softness. She just needed to find her way back to it. As she stood beneath the shade of the mango tree, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The pain was still there, but something stronger had begun to rise beneath it, something that felt like the first hint of freedom. Mina walked into the courtyard of the Corny compound in Deramo with slow steps, wiping her cheeks before anyone could see the shine left behind. She had made up her mind to leave. She would call her friend Lissy from Kamaru Market, ask her to drive over with that small blue car that always smelled like mango juice, and she would never look back at this house again. The thought made her breathe a little easier. For the first time that day, she felt a tiny bit of control returning to her. The air in Deramo was warm and dusty, the kind that wrapped itself around your skin, and she let it settle on her without fighting it. She looked at her phone, ready to dial, when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Saro's cousin Jabari burst through the doorway, looking as if all the color had been drained from his face. His phone buzzed in his hand, vibrating so hard it nearly slipped from his fingers. Mina almost laughed quietly at how strange he looked, but the laugh died when she saw his expression. Jabari wasn't the kind of person who got shaken easily. Not him, not with the way he joked about everything, even funerals. He pressed the phone to his ear, and Mina watched the muscles in his jaw tighten as he listened. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath with him. The wind stopped. The voices inside the house faded. Even the birds on the roof tiles fell silent as if they sensed the shift. Mina stood still, the papers she still held rustling softly in her hands. After a few seconds, Jabari lowered the phone and looked straight at her. His voice came out low, almost trembling when he said her name. He didn't say it with irritation or dismissal like some of the others. He said it as if the name itself carried weight, as if something had changed in the world and she was the center of it without even knowing why. Mina felt her heart tighten, the way it does when you step into deep water without meaning to. She took a small step toward him, unsure if she should ask or simply wait. Jabari swallowed hard, his eyes flicking back toward the house as if he wasn't sure who to tell first, but the phone buzzed again in his hand and he flinched. He whispered that the call was from Ulanda City, from someone important, someone asking for her, not Saro, not the uncles, not anyone else. Mina felt a chill rise along her arms, even in the warm Deramo air. She didn't know what the news was, but she knew it carried a different kind of weight than the insults she had endured all morning. It wasn't the heavy, painful weight of rejection. It was something sharper, louder, like the moment before lightning strikes. She stood there in the courtyard, listening to the quiet that had suddenly wrapped itself around everything, and she understood that her life had just shifted, even if she didn't yet know how. Jabari's voice shook a little as he told her the call was from a lawyer in Abrana, the capital. Mina blinked, confused, thinking it must be some mistake, maybe a wrong number or some distant administrative issue. But Jabari kept staring at her as if she were someone he had never really looked at before. He lifted the phone again, put it on speaker, and the courtyard suddenly filled with the calm, firm voice of a man who introduced himself as the one handling Grandpa Corin's estate. Mina felt her breath catch. She had visited the old man many times during his last months, bringing him porridge, peeling oranges for him, listening to his stories about fishing in the shallow rivers of Nambara. She had done those things quietly without expecting anyone else to notice. Now the lawyer said she needed to come to Abrana at once for the inheritance announcement. Only her. Not Sarah, not the uncles, not the cousins, her. The last word hung in the warm afternoon air like a spark waiting to catch fire. Jabari stepped back, almost stumbling as he repeated the message loudly enough for it to travel through every hallway of the house. It took less than 5 seconds for the meeting room door to fly open. One by one, they rushed out, all the faces that had spent the morning dismissing her, talking over her, whispering about how she didn't belong. Their eyes were wide, confused, almost frightened. Mina felt her heart thudding as the entire Corny family crowded the courtyard, staring at her as if someone had replaced her with a stranger. Sarah stood in the doorway, his face pale, his mouth slightly open, looking from her to his relatives and back again. No one spoke at first. It was strangely quiet, the kind of silence that comes right after a loud crash, when no one knows what they're supposed to do. Mina felt the weight of their stares pressing on her skin, but for once she didn't look away. She stood with her back straight, holding the forgotten papers in her hands, and waited. Some of the older relatives exchanged glances, whispering rapidly as if the ground beneath them had shifted. A few even tried to smile at her, small, awkward smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The same people who had pushed her aside that morning now watched her as if she held something they all needed. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it, a soft breath through her nose, because she didn't know what else to do. The lawyer's voice continued gently through the speaker, explaining that her presence was mandatory, that the reading of the will could not begin without her. When the call finally ended, Mina lowered her hand and looked around the courtyard. For the first time since she had married into this family, she didn't feel invisible. And for the first time maybe ever, they looked at her and didn't know what story to tell themselves. It was a strange moment, filled with shock and fear and something else rising quietly inside her, something warm and steady that felt like the beginning of change. The next morning in Abrana felt unreal to Mina, as if she were walking through someone else's dream. The city was loud and bright, full of tall buildings and fast voices, but inside the lawyer's office everything felt tight and breathless. She sat in a wooden chair near the window, hands folded in her lap, doing her best to stay calm while the Corny family filled the room with restless movements. No one spoke to her. They whispered among themselves, glancing at her the same way people look at a door they aren't sure they should open. Sarah sat beside her, his shoulders tense, his fingers tapping his knee. He looked like he wanted to speak but didn't know how to begin. Mina kept her eyes on the floor because looking anywhere else might show too much of what she felt. When the lawyer walked in with his stack of papers, the room went still. Even the city noise seemed to pause outside the glass. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the will in a calm voice that didn't match the storm building in the room. The shock came fast. Grandpa Corin had left Mina the controlling shares of the family business. Mina, not his sons, not the brothers who had argued for hours the day before, not the daughters who loved to tell stories about how close they had been to him. The lawyer continued, explaining that Mina also inherited the largest portion of the Deramo land. Mina felt the words land on her like drops of warm rain, soft but heavy, each one changing something inside her. The room erupted before she could breathe. Voices flew across the table. Some relatives stood up so quickly their chairs scraped the floor. Sarah's mother pressed a hand to her chest. One of the uncles shouted that it must be a mistake. Another demanded a different reading of the will. Mina sat quietly, almost stunned by the noise. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel angry. She felt something simpler, something sad and warm at the same time, like when a truth you already knew finally says itself out loud. The lawyer raised his hand, asking for silence, and when the room settled again, he explained why. He told them Mina had been the only one who visited Grandpa every week during his last months in Abrana. She cooked for him. She sat with him on slow afternoons when his hands shook too much to hold a cup. She brought him fruit from Deramo, even when she had little money for transport. She listened to his old stories with patience, and she made him laugh when the pain in his bones made him forget how. The others had come rarely, some not at all. As the lawyer spoke, Mina felt tears fill her eyes, not from pride but from the memory of those quiet days with the old man who had treated her with the kindness she never found in his house. The relatives were silent now, each one caught in their own reflection. Mina looked up slowly and met their eyes one by one. For the first time she didn't look away. She didn't shrink. She sat there in the center of the truth, steady and calm. While the family tried to understand how the girl they had pushed aside had become the person their grandfather trusted most. The room fell into chaos so quickly that Mina felt as if she were watching it all from somewhere outside her own body. One uncle slammed his hand on the table, another paced near the window, muttering about betrayal. The aunts argued with each other about who had visited Grandpa more often, though the truth sat in the air like a bright lamp no one wanted to look at. Someone accused someone else of hiding things. Someone else brought up an old fight from years ago in Kambala, shouting that this was proof the family had been broken long before today. Mina sat still through it all, her hands resting calmly in her lap. For the first time that morning they didn't shake. She looked down at them and almost smiled, a small, tired smile that came not from triumph, but from a deep understanding she wished she had reached sooner. She never asked for this. She never even imagined it. She only offered kindness to the old man because he was lonely, and she knew what loneliness felt like. The others had treated those visits like wasted time. She had treated them like a simple duty of the heart. Across the table, Saro sat frozen, his face pale, his gaze fixed on her in a way she wasn't used to. It was the look of someone who suddenly realized the weight of every silence he had allowed. Mina could almost feel the moment he understood how deeply he had failed to stand by her, not once or twice, but again and again. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to speak, then closed it slowly, collapsing back into his chair. Around him, the family kept scrambling, their words sharp, their voices tangled with fear. They argued about land, about shares, about fairness, but beneath it all lay the truth they were too proud to name. None of this would have happened if they had offered even a small piece of the warmth she had shown their grandfather. None of this would have happened if they had seen her as a person instead of an outsider. Mina listened to them fight, but she heard something else beneath the noise, something like the quiet shifting of her own heart. She finally felt steady, standing in a truth that belonged to her alone. She thought of Grandpa Corin's small apartment in Abrana, the smell of ginger tea, the sound of his slow laugh when she teased him about his old radio. He had given her this inheritance not to create war but to give thanks in the only way he knew how. When the shouting grew louder, Mina rose to her feet. The room went strangely still, as if everyone sensed the change in her posture. She didn't raise her voice or demand anything. She only looked at each face in front of her and let them see her clearly for the first time. She wasn't the quiet woman they pushed aside. She wasn't the girl they whispered about in hallways. She was the one who stayed when all of them walked away. And now the truth of that settled heavier on their hearts than any land or business ever could. Mina walked out of the lawyer's office with the voices of the Corney family still buzzing behind her, softer now, almost gentle, as if they were trying to gather pieces they had ignored for years. A few of them reached for her, saying her name with new sweetness, but Mina only nodded politely. She didn't feel anger, just a calm distance, like she had finally stepped onto her own ground after standing in other people's shadows for too long. The warm Abrana breeze touched her face as she pushed open the heavy glass door, and for a moment she closed her eyes and let it wash over her. It felt like fresh air after days of rain. She stood at the top of the steps, watching the city move around her, taxis honking, schoolchildren laughing in clusters. The world continuing without knowing her life had cracked open and rearranged itself in a single morning. Saro came out slowly, his footsteps unsure. When he stopped beside her, she didn't look at him right away. He whispered her name, the way he used to say it when they first met in Makiri town, back when everything felt simple. His apology came out in a broken rush, words tripping over each other as if he were trying to catch something before it fell. Mina listened quietly. She didn't pull away, but she didn't reach for him either. She didn't know what their marriage would become after this. Maybe it would heal. Maybe it would fade. She couldn't see that far yet. What she did know, with a clarity that felt stronger than the sun on her skin, was that she was done letting anyone decide her worth for her. She stepped forward, taking one slow breath, and felt a steadiness rise inside her, quiet but firm, like a promise she was finally ready to make to herself.